Hello and welcome to this video about genetic crosses. First of all, let's think about where genes come from. If you remember, in each of our cells we've got 23 pairs of chromosomes, and the blue and red colours here depict that one chromosome you get from your father and the other one from your mother. So if we were to concentrate on one pair of chromosomes, let's take chromosome pair 5 for example, you'd have one chromosome from your father and one chromosome from your mother. And the reason they're arranged in pairs is because each pair of chromosomes contains similar genes that code for particular characteristics that you've got. For example, if you took the characteristic tongue rolling, the genes for tongue rolling would be in the same pair. The same with things like eye colour, whether you've got earlobes, all those kind of characteristics. So if you remember inside your chromosomes then, if you were to take a section of this and blow it up, you'd have your DNA helixes, or your DNA helix packed in, which contains all of the DNA which determines what you look like. And the same for the mother then. If you took the chromosome that you'd inherited from your mother, again packed full of this DNA. Just to get our definitions right, first of all, if we were to take a small section of that DNA, that would be a gene. Okay, so a small section of that DNA would code for a particular gene. Now, with some characteristics in your body, they might be determined by the interaction of loads of different genes. For example, height is not as simple as saying, do you have the gene for being tall or do you have the gene for being short? There's a lot more things going into play. But some characteristics are just determined by one gene. So things like whether you can roll your tongue. So tongue rolling, or whether you've got earlobes or not. Some people have earlobes, other people's don't have any lobes and the ears are just attached straight to the head. And with these kind of characteristics that are controlled just by one gene, we can do genetic diagrams and predict whether the offspring are likely to have these characteristics or not. Now, with these genes that code for these characteristics, there will be a particular version of the gene that the father and the mother might carry. Now, a version of a gene, this is where it gets complicated, is called an allele. That is a version of the gene, and it just depends on the allele that the father is given you and the allele that your mother has given you. It depends how these alleles interact to determine whether you can roll your tongue or whether you've got earlobes, for example. So you will inherit a particular gene, but just further a particular allele, a particular version of that gene from your mother and from your father, and the way those two interact will determine your characteristics. Okay, so to go a little bit further, there's lots of new words associated with this topic. We've discussed allele already, so a form or a version of the gene. And to further complicate things, alleles can either be dominant or recessive. Now, so let's take the idea of tongue rolling then, for example, as our characteristic that we are going to look at. And some people can roll their tongues, other people cannot roll their tongues. And it will be a particular gene for tongue rolling that determines whether you can or not. And there will be two forms of that gene, two alleles for that gene. One will be, yes, we can tongue roll, so I'll give that a capital T for tongue rolling. That is one version of the gene that you could pick up from your parents. Or I'll do a lowercase t to say that you cannot tongue roll. So these are the two alleles that we're looking at, a capital T for tongue rolling and a lowercase t for cannot tongue roll. So you could adopt either version of the gene from your parents, and it's the way these two interact which determines whether you can roll your tongue or not. So let's just quickly think about it. If there's several different combinations you could have, your father, for example, could give you the capital T, and your mother could also give you the capital T. That's possible. Your father could give you the capital T and the mother the lowercase t in the chromosomes. The father could give the lowercase t and the mother, father could give the lowercase t and the mother the uppercase t, and the father could give the lowercase t again and the mother the lowercase t. So there are different possibilities for the alleles that you might get, the versions of the gene, the alleles that you might adopt from your parents. Going back to think about the chromosomes, you've got one from your father and one from your mother, so on those chromosomes you could have these versions of the alleles depending on the DNA of your mother and your father. What we need to think about now is whether these different combinations mean that we can roll our tongue or we can't roll our tongue. Now, a couple of them are a little bit easier. If you've got two capital T's for being able to roll your tongue, it will mean that you can roll your tongue because both of the alleles that you've got are capitals. If you look at the bottom one, you can see you've got both alleles for cannot roll your tongue. So both of those are for cannot, so that will mean you can't tongue roll. Where it gets a little bit more complicated is these two in the middle here, where you've got one of each. You've got a capital T and a lower t. And the rule is for this is that the capital letter always wins. So if you've got a capital letter in there, it means you can roll your tongue. So in both cases here, you will be a tongue roller. And we call those capital letter ones the dominant alleles. And if they're expressed, then that characteristic, so in this case tongue rolling, will always be expressed. So if the dominant allele is present, so this is always the capital letter, always the capital letter, and if this is present, the characteristic will be expressed. So that means if there's a capital T, you will be able to tongue roll because capital T means tongue roll. The recessive allele is a little bit different. The recessive allele is the lowercase letter and this is only expressed if two recessive alleles are together. So the characteristic is only expressed if you have two recessive alleles. Okay, so in this case here, you can carry the allele for not being able to tongue roll, but it won't be expressed. So they're kind of hidden in your genetics, but they're not expressed. Okay, so just to recap this bit before we move on then, you will receive genes from your parents, and A particular version of the gene is called an allele. So for example, if we're looking at the gene for tongue rolling, there are two different versions, so two different alleles. The capital T is always used to depict the dominant allele, and if the capital T is present, because it's dominant, that characteristic will always be expressed, even if there is that recessive one in there as well. If you've got the recessive allele, to not be able to tongue roll, that will only be expressed if you've got two recessive alleles. Okay, so now we're going to link our understanding of alleles, dominant and recessive alleles, to genetic crosses. And the characteristic we're going to look at is the hitchhiker's thumb. Now, if you have a look at your thumb now, you can either bend the tip of it back, so it's a hitchhiker's thumb, a little bit like this one, or you can't physically do that and your thumb is always straight. And there is a gene that controls whether you express the characteristic of a straight thumb or a bent thumb. And there are two alleles that you could inherit. So we'll use the capital T for straight thumb. Doesn't really matter what letters we use, but it's quite easy to see which is dominant and recessive when you use the letter T. So we'll use T for straight thumb, which is the dominant allele, and the lowercase t for bent thumb or the hitchhiker's thumb. So if you are someone who has a hitchhiker's thumb, the only way, or the only arrangement of alleles that you can have, is to have the two recessive alleles from your parents like that. Because for a recessive characteristic to be expressed, you have to have both of the recessive alleles. If you have a straight thumb, you could either have the combination of alleles where you have two of the dominant straight thumb alleles, or you could have a capital T and a lowercase t. So there are two possibilities there for your for the combination of alleles that you might have. If you know the alleles that someone carries, you can go on to predict the chances of their child expressing a particular characteristic. For example, if you chose a male with two dominant alleles, and you chose a female with heterozygous, or one of each alleles, you could work out the chances of this couple having a child with a hitchhiker's thumb or with a bent thumb. So when we do that, we take the male, and you can think about this as the sperm here with that particular allele, and then we'd have the female eggs, either capital T or little t, and you would cross those together and see what alleles you would find in the offspring. So if these two fertilise, you'd have two capital T's. If these two fertilise, you'd have two capital T's. Down here you'd have a big T and a lowercase t, and over here a big T and a lowercase t. So from before, we have to have a look and see whether the characteristic for a straight thumb or a bent thumb is going to be expressed. A straight thumb's dominant, and if you look, the dominant allele is present in all of the offspring. So there is absolutely no chance, a 0% chance, of having a hitchhiker's thumb, of having a bent thumb. So none of the offspring can have a bent thumb because the dominant allele is expressed in both. Let's think of an example then about where they might have a bent thumb. If we have a male with a dominant and recessive allele and a female with a dominant and recessive allele, if you were to cross those now, you would end up with the following possibilities for the offspring. And in this case, you can see that now you have a 1 in 4 or a 25% 25% chance of having a child with a bent thumb, or the ability to bend their thumb, the hitchhiker's thumb. You can either write it as a 25% chance, or you can write it as a ratio, so 3 to 1 in the favour of straight to bent. Okay, so using these alleles then, this is the important bit for the genetic crosses, being able to take the alleles from the parents, cross them, and work out the possibilities of the children, the offspring of these two parents, from expressing these certain characteristics. And while it's not particularly important for parents to want to know about whether their child's going to have a straight thumb or not, where this does come really important is in predicting the chances of their offspring inheriting certain genetic disorders. Okay, and we're going to look at that in a couple of cases with cystic fibrosis and polydactyly in a next video. For higher tier, we need to understand genetic crosses in a little bit more detail, so check out my video specifically for higher tier for that information. If you found this video useful, then please press the like button below and feel free to subscribe. Thanks for watching.